Imagine being fined thousands of dollars for legally hunting miles from your home just because your HOA president hates your hobby. This is the story of how petty tyranny backfired spectacularly. They thought rules could strip my freedom. So I bought the 8,000-acre forest they love to police, banned their access, and turned their nature walks into a legal minefield. This is how you fight HOAs and win. They fine me repeatedly for legally hunting deer and other game with every permit in order simply because my property line happened to border a large forest tract they seemed to think they controlled. They picked the wrong guy because I didn't just fight the fines. I ended up buying that entire forest, thousands of acres of it. And let's just say the HOA residents aren't enjoying their nature walks there anymore. What would you do if your hobby became a $25,000 liability overnight? It all started rather innocuously, as these things often do. I bought my house specifically because it was one of the few in the development that backed directly onto the woods, a huge expanse of privately owned forest that stretched for miles. For someone like me who finds peace and purpose in the outdoors, managing wildlife populations through responsible hunting, and simply existing away from the manicured lawns and suburban bustle, it was perfect. I spent years exploring those woods, learning the trails, observing the game patterns. I'm meticulous about regulations, state licenses, specific tags for deer season, proper firearm handling, respecting property lines, which I'd had surveyed when I bought the place. Everything by the book. The hunting itself always took place deep within the forest, far from any houses, certainly well outside the pathetic boundaries of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association jurisdiction. The forest wasn't theirs. It wasn't common land. It belonged to an old timber family trust based out of state. My initial interactions with neighbors were fine. Most people kept to themselves, a few polite nods here and there. The HOA seemed relatively dormant, mostly concerned with lawn length and trash can visibility, the usual petty stuff. Ever met someone who weaponized a pet parade? Let me introduce Brenda. Then Brenda Albright got elected HOA president. Brenda, a woman whose primary life experience seemed to involve complaining at planning board meetings and organizing the annual pet parade, suddenly discovered a new purpose, wielding the minuscule power of the HOA like a medieval monarch. She had this way of speaking, a sort of pinched wine delivered with absolute certainty, that grated on me from the first neighborhood meeting I attended. She seemed to believe the HOA bylaws were scripture, and she was the sole ordained interpreter. Brenda once told the HOA meeting, "Guns and dead animals have no place in civilized communities." Her son? A vegan activist who plastered "ban trophy hunting" flyers on my mailbox. This wasn't about bylaws, it was a crusade. The trouble began one crisp Saturday morning during deer season. I'd had a successful hunt deep in the woods, ethically harvesting a decent buck well over a mile from my property line, certainly nowhere near the development. I'd field dressed it respectfully where it fell, it out properly on a game cart, and arrived back at my garage around midday, intending to process it later. I was unloading my gear, cased rifle, my backpack, the carefully wrapped meat in coolers, when Brenda's golf cart screeched to a halt at the end of my driveway. She hopped out with an agility that belied her usual sedentary posture, clutching a clipboard like a shield. "Excuse me," she chirped, her voice tight with disapproval. "What is all this?" I paused, frankly a little surprised by the confrontational tone. "Good morning, Brenda. Just getting back from a hunt." I gestured vaguely towards the woods. Managed to fill my tag. Her eyes narrowed, scanning my gear, lingering on the coolers. "Hunting? You know that's not permitted in Whispering Pines." I kept my voice even. "Brenda, I wasn't hunting in Whispering Pines. I was hunting way back in the forest on the lumber company's land, where it's perfectly legal with the state permits I have right here." I tapped my jacket pocket where my license resided. My activities were nowhere near the HOA property. She sniffed, consulting her clipboard as if it contained divine revelations. "The bylaws clearly state that activities which disturb the peace or endanger the community are prohibited. Discharging firearms, bringing carcasses through the neighborhood, it's simply not acceptable. I felt a flicker of annoyance. Brenda, the shot was fired miles from here, posing zero danger, and processing game is a normal part of legal hunting. It's being handled discreetly and hygienically in my own garage on my own property. It doesn't violate any specific bylaw I'm aware of. She waved a dismissive hand. The sight of it is disturbing to residents. We have children here. Consider this your first official warning. We will be monitoring the situation. Before I could respond further, she climbed back into her golf cart and zipped away, leaving me standing there with my legally harvested deer and a growing sense of disbelief. This wasn't about safety or bylaws. This felt personal. It was clear Brenda just didn't like hunting, and she intended to use the HOA's flimsy authority to stop me. That first encounter set the stage for what would become a protracted, ridiculous, and ultimately very expensive battle, mostly for them, as it turned out. But at that moment, I just felt weary. Already anticipating the bureaucratic nonsense Brenda was undoubtedly brewing up back in her command center, probably drafting new, vaguely worded amendments about offensive displays of sporting activities. As we spoke, the peace I sought in the woods was about to be rudely interrupted by suburban pettiness. Little did Brenda know, she was pushing someone who valued that peace and the rights that protected it far more than she could possibly imagine. My connection to that forest, the place she was trying to police from afar, ran deeper than just recreation. It was a fundamental part of why I chose to live there. And I wasn't about to let some power-tripping HOA president dictate my legal activities miles away from her perfectly manicured lawn. The initial warning from Brenda wasn't just an idle threat. It was the opening salvo in a campaign of HOA-sanctioned harassment. True to her word, the monitoring began almost immediately. I started noticing her golf cart driving slowly past my house more often, especially on weekend mornings or evenings when I might be heading out or returning from the woods, whether I was hunting or just hiking. Sometimes one of her board allies, usually a retiree named Gary, who seemed to have nothing better to do, would be parked down the street pretending to read a newspaper. It was intrusive and frankly creepy. I continued my hunting activities, ensuring I was even more discreet, parking my truck deeper in the garage before unloading, minimizing any visible signs from the street. But Brenda didn't need concrete proof. Assumption and her personal disapproval were enough. A week after our driveway confrontation, the first official letter arrived via certified mail, complete with the Whispering Pines HOA logo embossed at the top. It formally cited me for violating Bylaw 7.14, engaging in activities detrimental to the aesthetic harmony and peaceful enjoyment of the community. The evidence cited was observation of hunting paraphernalia and reports of activity inconsistent with community standards. It carried a $100 fine and demanded immediate cessation of all hunting-related activities, regardless of location. I was furious, not just at the fine, but at the deliberate vagueness and the implication that my perfectly legal off-property pastime was somehow detrimental. I immediately pulled out my copy of the HOA CC and AMP, RS, and bylaws. I read through Bylaw 7.14 and its related sections. There was absolutely nothing explicitly prohibiting hunting off HOA property. The language was subjective and clearly intended as a catch-all for things the board disliked. There were clauses about discharging firearms within the development, which I'd never done, clauses about noise nuisances, again irrelevant, and clauses about property appearance. Nothing addressed legal hunting miles away on someone else's land. I drafted a calm, professional response. I reiterated that my hunting occurred far from the development, entirely legally on land not owned or controlled by the HOA. I included copies of my state hunting license, my deer tags, a map showing the vast distance between the development and my typical hunting areas, and I highlighted the specific section of CC and AMP, RS stating the HOA's jurisdiction ended at our property lines. I stated firmly that I had not violated Bylaw 7.14, that the observation of hunting paraphernalia on my own property was not a violation, and that I would not be paying the fine nor ceasing my legal activities. I sent it via certified mail, ensuring I had proof of delivery. Brenda's response was swift and dismissive. Another letter arrived, this time stating the board had reviewed my appeal and found it without merit. The fine was upheld. Furthermore, a new fine of $250 was being levied for improper disposal of refuse, vaguely linked to biological matter, presumably related to game processing. Though they offered zero evidence, they were essentially fining me based on Brenda's assumptions about what I did inside my own garage after returning from the woods. It was becoming clearer that logic and evidence meant nothing to them. This was a power play fueled by Brenda's personal agenda. I spoke to a neighbor, Mark, who lived a few doors down. He was generally quiet, but rolled his eyes when I mentioned Brenda. Yeah, she's on a tear, he sighed. Tried to cite me last month because my garden hose wasn't coiled perfectly. Thinks she's the queen around here since her husband left. Mark wasn't a hunter, but he agreed the HOA was massively overstepping if they were trying to police legal activity off their property. He warned me Brenda had the support of Gary and another board member, meaning she usually got her way. This neighborly commiseration, while small, bolstered my resolve. I wasn't entirely alone in thinking this was absurd. I also consulted briefly with a friend who practices real estate law. While he didn't specialize in HOA disputes, he confirmed my reading of the CC and AMP, RS, unless there was explicit language prohibiting off-property hunting or bringing legally harvested game onto one's property. The HOA's position was extremely weak. He advised me to document absolutely everything. Save all correspondence, including envelopes with postmarks, take time-stamped photos of my gear being stored appropriately, maybe even get a statement from the game warden confirming the legality of my hunting locations and practices. He warned that HOAs can be notoriously difficult and sometimes try to win through attrition, burying homeowners in paperwork and threats of liens. The threats started soon after. $1,200 in fines, $5,000 legal fees, a lien notice that'd tank my credit. Brenda's smug smirk at the mailbox said it all: give up or lose everything. But I'd spent 12 years building my business. If she wanted a war, I'd bankrupt myself to bury her. Fines piled up like confetti at Brenda's victory parade. $100 for biological hazards, venison in my freezer. $250 for trauma-inducing visuals, my muddy boots on the porch. Each envelope was a grenade, and my savings were the pin. The next letter ignored my rebuttals entirely and simply added the fines together, tacking on late fees and mentioning the HOA's right to place a lien on my property if the outstanding balance wasn't settled promptly. This was a significant escalation. A lien could affect my credit, mortgage, ability to sell the house eventually. It was the HOA's nuclear option for noncompliance. They weren't just fining me anymore. They were actively threatening my financial standing and homeownership over something I had every legal right to do miles away from their petty kingdom. The frustration was immense, but it was quickly solidifying into cold determination. They thought they could bully me into submission. They underestimated my stubbornness and deep-seated belief in property rights, both mine and the rights of the owner of the forest. They were implicitly trying to control. Brenda's little war was about to push me in a direction she couldn't possibly anticipate. Brenda wanted a battle of bylaws, but I had a nuclear option, and the access codes were buried in county tax records. The fight wasn't just about hunting anymore. It was about drawing a line against unreasonable overreach. And I started thinking, what was the ultimate line I could draw? The fines kept piling up, accompanied by increasingly strident letters threatening liens and legal action. Each certified mail delivery felt like another turn of the screw. My attempts at rational discussion were met with form letter dismissals from the HOA board, clearly dictated by Brenda. It was like arguing with a brick wall, one convinced it held dominion over the entire county. Paying the fines felt wrong. It would legitimize their ridiculous overreach. Ignoring them felt risky given the lean threat. I needed a different approach, something that addressed the root of problem, not just the symptoms. The root, as I saw it, was the fuzzy boundary between my property, the HOA sphere of influence, and the vast forest beyond. Brenda and her cronies were acting as if their authority somehow extended into those woods, or at least allowed them to penalize me for what I did there. What if, I mused, that boundary became crystal clear? What if the ownership of that forest wasn't some distant abstract entity, but someone they couldn't intimidate? Why buy a forest? Because HOAs can't fine you if you own the judge, jury, and courtroom. My first concrete step was hiring a professional land surveyor. Not just any surveyor, but a highly reputable firm known for its meticulous work, particularly in boundary disputes. I wanted an ironclad, updated survey of my property line, confirming precisely where HOA land ended and the forest began. It was an expense, costing a couple $1,000s, but I viewed it as an investment in ammunition for the fight ahead. The surveyors spent a couple of days out there with their sophisticated equipment. Naturally, their presence didn't go unnoticed. Brenda herself drove down in her golf cart on the second day, demanding to know what was going on. I was home and intercepted her. They're confirming my property lines. Brenda, I said, keeping my tone neutral, making sure all my fencing and landscaping are in the right place. Due diligence, you know. She eyed the surveyor suspiciously. Seems like an unnecessary expense unless you're planning something, she muttered, clearly fishing. Just being a responsible homeowner, I replied smoothly. Unlike some who seem intent on policing activities miles beyond their jurisdiction. Her face tightened, but the surveyors were working well within my lot, and she couldn't actually stop them. She eventually drove off in a huff. The survey results came back exactly as expected, confirming my original understanding and the boundaries shown on my deed. My property ended cleanly at the edge of the woods. The forest tract was entirely separate. While the surveyors were working, I asked them informally about the large adjacent parcel, forest itself. They knew the tract well. It was one of the largest remaining privately owned timberlands in the region. They confirmed it belonged to the Black Creek Timber Trust, managed by an aging executive based several states away. They mentioned casually that there had been inquiries over the years, mostly from developers looking to carve it up, but the trust had historically been resistant to selling, especially piecemeal. This sparked an idea. If the trust was potentially interested in selling, perhaps not to developers, but maybe to a conservation minded individual, someone who appreciated the land as it was. This led me down a rabbit hole of online research. I spent hours digging into county property records, tax assessments, and corporate filings related to the Black Creek Timber Trust. I learned the trust was established decades ago. The primary beneficiaries were elderly or deceased, and the current executive, a man named Arthur Jenkins, was indeed quite old himself. Managing thousands of acres of timberland remotely likely represented a significant administrative burden, perhaps one he was looking to offload. The tax records showed the annual property taxes were substantial. Maybe the pressure was mounting to liquidate the asset. I also searched for any records of past offers or inquiries. Interestingly, I found minutes from an old county planning meeting 5 or 6 years prior, where the Whispering Pines HOA under a previous president had inquired about purchasing a 50-foot buffer strip of the forest land immediately behind the development. According to the minutes, their informal offer was laughably low and politely declined by the trust's representatives at the time, who cited a desire not to sell off small portions. Had Brenda revived this idea? Was her harassment of me partly motivated by a desire to somehow pressure the trust or perhaps make the area seem problematic, driving down the value for a future HOA bid? It felt a bit conspiratorial, but knowing Brenda's thirst for control, it wasn't entirely implausible. She might see securing a buffer zone as her grand legacy project. My investigation felt like gathering pieces of a puzzle. The HOA's overreach, Brenda's personality, The existence of this huge, potentially available forest tract, the trust's apparent reluctance to deal with developers or lowball offers. A daring, almost outlandish thought began to crystallize. What if I bought the forest? The entire thing. It seemed insane at first. We're talking about thousands of acres, a multi-million dollar proposition. But the more I thought about it, the less crazy it seemed. Not easy by any stretch, but maybe just feasible. It would be the ultimate solution. It would guarantee my access and right to hunt. It would put an absolute legal end to the HOA's harassment regarding my activities there. And the sweet irony, it would give me control over the very land Brenda seemed to covet. The fines, the threats, the petty surveillance, they all suddenly felt like minor annoyances compared to the potential of this grand counter move. My documentation continued. The survey results were filed carefully, but my focus shifted from defensive measures to proactive strategic planning. The HOA thought they were backing me into a corner. They had no idea they were pushing me towards acquiring the entire landscape. The idea of buying the Black Creek Timber Trust land evolved from a wild fantasy into a serious, consuming project. This wasn't like buying a car or even a house. It was a complex, high stakes endeavor requiring significant capital and careful negotiation. The first hurdle was financial. Thousands of acres, even undeveloped timberland, represented a value far beyond my immediate cash reserves. I spent weeks analyzing my finances, savings, investments, retirement accounts. I owned a couple of other minor assets I could potentially liquidate. It still wouldn't be enough. Not even close. I explored financing options, spoke discreetly with a commercial loan officer at my bank who specialized in large land deals. It was daunting. Banks are often wary of lending huge sums for non-income producing land unless there's a solid plan for timber harvesting or development, neither of which was my primary goal. My goal was preservation, personal use, and frankly, spite against the HOA. Then I thought about my old college roommate, Dave. Dave had done well for himself in tech, and more importantly, he was an ardent conservationist and outdoorsman, someone who shared my frustration with suburban sprawl and bureaucratic overreach. We'd kept in touch, occasionally going on hunting or fishing trips together. I broached the subject with him cautiously over a weekend camping trip, far from prying ears. I laid out the whole situation, the HOA harassment, the forest land, the aging trust, the potential opportunity. To my surprise, Dave didn't laugh. He listened intently, nodding along. So, you want to buy a forest to get back at your HOA, Karen? He asked, a grin spreading across his face. Partly, I admit it, but also to protect it, keep it from becoming another housing development, guarantee our access for hunting, hiking forever. The conservation angle appealed to him as much as the revenge plot. He revealed he'd been looking for a significant long-term investment aligned with his environmental values. We spent the rest of the weekend brainstorming. We could form an LLC, pool our resources, maybe bring in one or two other trusted, like-minded investors if needed. Dave had access to capital I didn't, and I had the local knowledge, the motivation, and had already done the initial legwork. We agreed to proceed, forming a partnership dedicated to acquiring the Black Creek property. This partnership gave the plan teeth. We hired a lawyer specializing in large real estate transactions and conservation easements. Our lawyer made the initial confidential inquiry to Arthur Jenkins, executive of the Black Creek Timber Trust. We didn't mention the HOA situation. Our angle was purely that of a private investment group interested in acquiring and preserving the timberland tract in its entirety. Jenkins, as I suspected, was indeed elderly and increasingly weary of managing the vast property. Our timing was fortuitous. He confirmed the trust was exploring options for divestment. He seemed genuinely pleased that our stated interest was preservation rather than immediate logging or subdivision. He mentioned having rebuffed numerous vulture-like developer inquiries over the years and seemed wary of lowball offers. This worked in our favor. We weren't trying to flip it. We intended to be long-term stewards. The negotiation process was tense and protracted, stretching over several months. There were detailed surveys, environmental assessments, timber evaluations necessary for valuation, even if immediate harvest wasn't the plan, and lots of legal back and forth. Dave and I flew out to meet Jenkins in person, establishing rapport and reassuring him of our intentions. He was sharp, experienced, and drove a hard bargain. But ultimately, he seemed to prefer selling to us over other potential buyers. During this entire period, I had to maintain absolute secrecy within the neighborhood. The HOA fines continued to accrue. The threatening letters kept coming. I paid one or two of the smaller earlier fines under protest purely as a strategic move to delay the lien process while the forest acquisition was pending. It galled me to send them a check, but my lawyer advised it might keep them from escalating to immediate legal action before we were ready. Brenda remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. She interpreted my partial payment as a sign I was finally cracking under the pressure. She even made a smug comment to me one day while I was getting my mail. "Glad to see you're starting to understand the rules, Mr. Miller. It's for the good of the community." I just gave her a tight smile and said nothing. Inside, I was imagining the look on her face when she found out I owned the thousands of acres behind her precious community. There was one close call. A junior lawyer working for the trust needed some specific county zoning information and inadvertently contacted the Whispering Pines HOA office, mistaking them for a local governing body. Luckily, the regular office admin answered, not Brenda, and simply redirected the lawyer to the correct county department. If Brenda had taken that call, she might have put two and two together. But fate, it seemed, was on my side. Finally, after months of negotiation, due diligence, and nerve-wracking financial arrangements that stretched Dave and me to our limits, the deal was done. The contracts were signed, the funds transferred. The LLC that Dave and I had formed was now the legal owner of the entire Black Creek Timber Trust property. Thousands of acres of forest bordering the entire backside of the Whispering Pines development belonged to us. The trust lawyer called it a straightforward closing. But when I first walked my forest, no permits, no Brenda, just ancient oaks and silence, I choked up. This wasn't a purchase. It was a homecoming. The biggest keep out sign imaginable was about to be erected, metaphorically and literally. Phase 1 of Operation Forest Fortress was complete. Phase 2, the reveal, was about to begin. The ink was barely dry on the closing documents when I initiated Phase 2, Operation Boundary Enforcement. The sheer scale of owning that much land was still sinking in a mixture of exhilaration and the weight of responsibility, but my immediate focus was clear: securing the perimeter and delivering a long overdue message to the Whispering Pines HOA and its busybody president, Brenda Albright. The first step involved signage. Not just any signs, but professionally made, large, highly visible signs that left no room for misinterpretation. I commissioned about 50 of them, made of durable metal emblazed with stark white lettering on a dark background. Private property. Posted. No trespassing. Hunting, hiking, camping, ATV riding, and all other access strictly prohibited. Violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of law. Property owned by Iron Creek Holdings, LLC. Crucially, at the bottom of several key signs placed near the main informal access points leading from the HOA development, I added a very specific line. Access is expressly forbidden for all residents, guests, and affiliates of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I wanted zero ambiguity. The previous owner might have allowed decades of permissive use, creating an assumption of access among the neighbors. That assumption needed to be shattered decisively. Over the next weekend, with the help of Dave and a couple of sturdy friends sworn to secrecy, we embarked on a strategic signposting mission. We used GPS to follow the property line adjacent to the development, placing signs roughly every 100 yards, ensuring maximum visibility. We focus particularly on the well-worn footpaths leading from backyards into the woods, trails used for dog walking, kids playing, and casual nature strolls by the very residents whose HOA board had decided my presence near those woods, miles deeper, no less, was unacceptable. We drove sturdy metal posts deep into the ground, securely bolting the signs. It was satisfying work, each thud of the post driver feeling like a small victory. The immediate reaction from the few neighbors who happened to be out in their yards was confusion. A few waves, questioning looks. We just smiled, waved back, and continued our work. No explanation offered yet. The signs would speak for themselves soon enough. The true fireworks began on Monday morning. I made sure to be working from home, positioned with a clear view of one of the main former access trails. Around 9 a.m., Brenda Albright came marching down the path, clipboard in hand, clearly on one of her neighborhood patrol rounds. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the brand new gleaming sign directly blocking the trail entrance. Her face went through a remarkable series of transformations, confusion, squinting disbelief, then righteous indignation. She actually reached out and poked the sign as if it were an illusion. Then she spun around, eyes scanning, and spotted me standing near my back porch, sipping coffee. She stormed across the intervening lawns, likely violating several bylaws herself in her haste, and planted herself at the edge of my property line, just feet from where the new boundary technically began. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the sign. "Who put this up? This is community access land. You can't just block it." I took a slow sip of coffee. "Good morning, Brenda. Actually, it's not community access land. It hasn't been for, well, since last Friday afternoon, technically." Her jaw worked silently for a moment. "What are you talking about? The Timber Trust owns that land. We've always used these trails." "Correction," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. "The Timber Trust sold that land. It's now owned by a private investment group." I paused for effect. "An investment group of which I am the managing partner." I let that hang in the air. Brenda's face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally dawning horror as the implication hit her. "You bought the entire forest?" The words came out as a strangled whisper. "That's right, Brenda. All several thousand acres of it. The very land you were so concerned about me using legally. Now it's mine." "Ours," I corrected, gesturing broadly towards the woods. "And as new owners, we've decided to exercise our property rights and restrict access, especially," I added, making eye contact, "to residents of Whispering Pines." Oh, given the demonstrated lack of respect for property boundaries and legal activities shown by its leadership, she sputtered, turning red. "You can't do this. There must be easements. We have rights." "No, Brenda, you don't," I replied firmly. "We did extensive title searches. There are zero recorded easements granting access to the HOA or its residents across this property. Any previous access was purely permissive, granted by the former owners, and that permission is now revoked. These signs are legally binding. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I showed her a copy of the newly recorded deed from my pocket. The official stamps, the legal descriptions, the name of our LLC. It was undeniable. She snatched it, scanned it wildly, her face paling. This is, this is outrageous. You did this just to spite us." "My motivations are my own, Brenda," I said coolly. "But let's just say the HOA's relentless harassment over my perfectly legal off-property activities provided significant inspiration. You wanted control over what happened near those woods? Congratulations. You drove someone to buy the woods themselves. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd ask you to respect the property line. You're currently trespassing on HOA common ground, but step any further." I nodded towards the sign she'd been accosting, "and you'll be trespassing on my land." She stared at me, utterly speechless for perhaps the first time in her life. Then, with a strangled noise of fury and defeat, she turned and practically ran back towards her golf cart, the deed still clutched in her hand. The rumor mill in Whispering Pines must have exploded that day. Throughout the afternoon, I saw little knots of neighbors gathering near the signs, pointing, talking, looking towards my house. The forest they had taken for granted, their backyard playground, was suddenly, definitively off limits. The HOA's campaign against me had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. They weren't just failing to stop my hunting, their actions had directly resulted in the loss of all access to the woods for the entire community. The irony was thick enough to taste, and this was just the beginning. Enforcement would be the next necessary step. The installation of the signs and confrontation with Brenda were just the opening act. The real test was enforcing the new reality. Whispering Pines residents had enjoyed unfettered access to those woods for years and habits, especially those involving perceived entitlements, die hard. Dave and I knew that simply putting up signs wouldn't be enough. We needed consistent legal enforcement. First, we invested in technology. We strategically installed a network of high-resolution motion-activated trail cameras covering the main former access points and other likely spots where people might try to sneak in. These weren't cheap security cameras. They were weatherproof units designed for wildlife monitoring, capable of capturing clear images day or night and sending alerts to our phones. We also made formal notifications. Our lawyer sent a registered letter to the Whispering Pines HOA board, officially informing them of the change in ownership, reiterating the no trespassing policy with a specific clause about HOA residents, and warning that any violations would be pursued legally. We included copies of the deed and the survey map. There would be no plausible deniability for the board or the residents they represented. Predictably, the first few days saw several attempts to ignore the signs. Dog walkers pretending they hadn't seen them. Teenagers looking for a shortcut. Even a couple of older residents who seemed to believe their long-standing habit granted them grandfathered rights. Our cameras captured everything. For the first few incidents involving adults clearly testing the boundaries, I opted for a direct but firm approach. I intercepted a couple walking their labradoodle about 50 yards past a prominent sign. Folks, excuse me, I called out, walking towards them, but staying on my side of the property line. You seem to have missed the sign back there. This is private property now, and it's posted against trespassing. They looked flustered. Oh, we've been walking here for years, the woman protested. I understand that, I replied patiently. But the property has new owners, and the access policy has changed. The previous owner allowed access. We do not. I need you to please return to the HOA common area. They grumbled but complied, pulling their dog back onto the manicured grass. The encounter with Gary, Brenda's staunch ally on the board, was less pleasant. I received a camera alert showing him deliberately stepping over a down log right next to a sign and proceeding down a trail. I walked out to meet him. Gary, I said, my voice sharp. Turn around. You know you're trespassing. He stopped, puffing himself up. Now see here. This is ridiculous. Brenda told us you were doing this just to be difficult. We're going to fight this. Fight what, Gary? I asked calmly. My right as a property owner to control who comes onto my land, while you're standing squarely on it, violating the law, the same law you, as an HOA board member, are supposed to uphold within your own community. I held up my phone, showing him the clear footage from the trail camera. This is being recorded, by the way, and I have footage of you deliberately ignoring the posted sign. Turn around now, or my next call is to the sheriff's department to report a trespasser. His bluster deflated quickly. He knew he was caught red-handed. Muttering threats about lawyers and HOA action, he retreated back the way he came. The situation with unsupervised children and teenagers was trickier. We didn't want to involve law enforcement with minors if avoidable. For those instances captured on camera, we forwarded the images and a warning notice to the HOA board via our lawyer, demanding they inform the parents and ensure it didn't happen again, reminding them of the liability issues involved if someone were to get hurt while trespassing. This approach seemed to work. The instances of kids wandering into the woods dropped significantly after the first couple of notices went out. The real test came about 2 weeks later. Brenda, perhaps believing enough time had passed, or that I wouldn't dare escalate, decided to stage a protest walk. She gathered about 5 or 6 sympathetic residents and deliberately marched past one of the main signs onto a clearly marked trail, ostensibly to inspect the illegal blockage of community access. The trail camera immediately alerted me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called the county sheriff's non emergency line, reported an active trespassing situation involving multiple individuals who had ignored posted signs and verbal warnings, referencing my previous encounter with Gary, who was among the group, and requested an officer be dispatched. A sheriff's deputy arrived within about 15 minutes. I met him at the road, quickly explained the situation, showed him the deed proving ownership, the clear signage, and the real time feed from the trail camera on my phone showing Brenda and her entourage still defiantly standing on my property. The deputy sighed, clearly familiar with HOA disputes, but the law was clear. He walked down the path, confronted the group, and explained that they were in fact trespassing on private property. Brenda launched into a tirade about historical use and community rights. The deputy patiently but firmly cut her off, explained the concept of permissive use versus legal easement, or lack thereof, and informed them that the property owner wished to press charges if they didn't leave immediately. Faced with the very real prospect of receiving trespassing citations, the protest dissolved instantly. Brenda and her crew scurried back to HOA land, faces a mixture of fury and humiliation. The deputy took down everyone's name and issued them formal warnings, noting that future violations would result in charges. News of the sheriff being called spread through Whispering Pines like wildfire. It became undeniably clear that the forest was truly off limits and that the new owner was serious about enforcement. The internal HOA dynamics began to shift dramatically. Neighbors who previously supported Brenda, or at least tolerated her, were now furious at her. Their casual access to the woods, something they valued, was gone, and they correctly identified Brenda's antagonistic campaign against me as the catalyst. I heard through Mark, my sympathetic neighbor, that the next HOA board meeting was explosive. Residents demanded answers from Brenda about why she had provoked the situation. Accusations flew. Gary reportedly looked sheepish while Brenda struggled to defend her actions, blaming me entirely for being unreasonable. Her support on the board began to fracture. The HOE even had their lawyer review the situation, likely at considerable expense, only to receive the same conclusion. The LLC owned the land free and clear. There were no easements, and the no trespassing enforcement was perfectly legal. They had absolutely no recourse. My hunting continued, undisturbed, now taking place entirely on land I co-owned. I could wander miles into my forest, set up a deer stand, and enjoy the peace and solitude without a shred of worry about HOA interference. The threatening letters stopped. The fines disappeared from my account portal as if they never existed. Brenda avoided eye contact whenever we happened to cross paths. The sense of vindication was immense. But it wasn't just triumphant. It was peaceful. The constant stress of the conflict, the bureaucratic battling, it was all gone, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves in my own woods. Owning that forest wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about securing tranquility, preserving a piece of nature, and drawing an unmovable line against petty tyranny. It cost a lot of money, time, and emotional energy. But standing on a ridge overlooking thousands of acres of protected woodland, knowing it was safe from both developers and HOA Karens, absolutely worth it. Last month, Brenda resigned. Gary's now HOA president and begged me to reconsider access for the community. I gifted him a trail camera photo of a 10-point buck grazing where his kids built stick forts. Tell the board, I said, this land's managed responsibly now. Unlike your leadership, the silence? Priceless.